Imagine you were married to someone who constantly lied to you, laughed at you, belittled you, someone who controlled you and stole everything from you. Today, that would constitute a criminal offense. It's called controlling or coercive behavior. But it doesn't apply to countries. And it's why every Scot should be very, very angry indeed. But before I start to list the many grievances some Scots rightly have about England's involvement in their country, you may be wondering why an Englishman is narrating this film. Well, the honest answer is this. Like many of my fellow countrymen, I believe in basic values such as fairness, honesty, and integrity. The same cannot be said of the entitled English ruling classes, who have held sway over England since its foundation in 927 AD. The problem is, since 1707, they've also held sway over Scotland too. So as we don't want to attract the usual angry, whinging jocks with a grievance-type comments of those who persist in trying to defend a union which demonstrably is not and never has worked in Scotland's best interests, it falls to me, an Englishman, to explain Scotland's true position in this union, not the fairy tale version repeatedly told with the help of England's compliant mainstream media. After all, what other country in the world today would willingly put up with the treatment Scotland has endured since that fateful day on the 1st of May, 1707, when Scotland was effectively annexed as a colony of England? If you don't believe Scotland was annexed, and you still believe England's narrative that Scotland and England willingly joined together as equal partners in a union for their mutual benefit, then keep watching. Let's start with the words of the 16th century English spy and famous novelist, the author of Robinson Crusoe, Daniel Defoe, who laid it out for all to see when, after the documents of union were signed in Edinburgh the year before, under some considerable duress, he said, "The Scots will be allowed to send to Westminster a handful of men who will make no weight whatever. They will be allowed to sit there for form's sake to be laughed at." 318 years later, nothing has changed. Many of Westminster's English MPs are today still laughing at the massively outnumbered and irrelevant Scots sitting on the green benches of that English Parliament. Westminster is, after all, as former Prime Minister Boris Johnson admitted, the English Parliament. So as if this wasn't enough, let me begin my exploration of why Scots should be very angry. But let me say, before I start, there are so many things I love about England, but the entitled ruling class is certainly not one of them. As an Englishman, I am certainly not anti-English, but if what has been, and is still being done to Scotland, were being done to England by another country, I would be very angry, and given it's being done to your country, you should be too. Also, I have yet to meet a Scot who hates the English, publicly at least, although things might have been a different story when Bruce and Wallace were alive and battling to maintain Scotland's freedom from a once all-powerful England all those centuries ago. Personally, I've always found Scots to be a warm and welcoming people. What's more, the fact that Scotland had a system of the common good at its heart, and its crown represented the community of the realm, the people, not the entitled classes, has also always appealed to me. That's why Scottish monarchs were called King or Queen of Scots, the people, not like in England, where the monarch was either the King or Queen of England, ruling by divine right over the land and property of the country for the benefit of a small band of privileged people, which was, and to a much greater extent than you might think, is still central to the whole system of governance there today. But England is not Scotland, and Scotland is most definitely not England, despite the many attempts by the English state to erase all traces of Scottish culture and history, something which has proved impossible to do. Scottish culture, loved the world over, simply cannot be erased, and so different is this culture it makes a mockery of the forced union between these two very different countries. The English Dress Act of 1746 banned the wearing of the Highland dress, including the kilt, in Scotland. This was the year in which the Jacobite Rising failed to restore Scotland's independence by removing the Hanoverians after the 1707 Union 39 years before, following England's victory at Culloden. For a decade afterwards, there were no fewer than 600 English military garrisons across Scotland, there to brutally suppress the Scots against another uprising against their English masters. And the speaking of Gaelic was banned too, though not strictly by the English, but by James VI of Scotland in 1616, 13 years after his accession to the throne of England as James I. For his own selfish dynastic reasons, James wanted to strengthen the more powerful Kingdom of England, over which he now ruled, and banning the speaking of Gaelic was an attempt to civilize the Highlanders and bring them under the control of the English crown. Ironically, James did not live to see his dream of a united kingdom, and in any event uniting the two countries was not possible because the systems of government in England and Scotland were, and still are, entirely different. It's only due to the fact that Scotland is an annexed country under England's control that the English system prevails, illegally even under the terms of the Treaty of Union, which guaranteed a continuation of a separate Scottish legal system. That means the so-called UK Supreme Court in London, set up by Tony Blair's government in 2009, has no jurisdiction in Scotland, but continues to maintain that it does. To fully understand why the Kingdom of Scotland and the Kingdom of England could not be legally joined together as one kingdom, you need to understand the differences between the two systems of government represented by the crowns of both kingdoms. In Scotland, the crown represents the community of the realm, in other words, the people, who in Scotland are sovereign over their monarch and over their government, even though today politicians in Scotland also prefer to ignore this fact. In England, the monarch rules by divine authority, in other words, God appointed them, and they cannot be challenged by the people who are their subjects. Because no English monarch has ever been prepared to cede any of their God-given sovereignty over the people, especially not to the Scots, even in their own country, no English monarch has ever legally become King or Queen of Scots because they refuse to swear the Scottish accession oath in its entirety, as required under Scots law. That means that the crown of Scotland and its kingdom remain intact, but effectively dormant, as England assumes the right, posing as the UK, to rule in Scotland, a right it does not have in reality. And in turn, it allows England to take whatever resources which belong to the people of Scotland out of Scotland, albeit illegally, to sell off to whoever they choose and leave Scotland far poorer than it ought to be. Consider this. Many of those individuals I mentioned earlier, who try to defend a union which is indefensible, will make out Scotland has a fiscal deficit because the government calling itself the UK says so. But after nearly 6 decades of oil and gas flowing into England's coffers from Scottish waters, Scotland has remained relatively poor when compared to countries like Norway, which has a very similar population to Scotland, yet has gone on to become the world's 4th richest country, with a sovereign wealth fund of more than $1.7 trillion US. Scotland, under the UK's management, has no sovereign wealth fund at all, not a single penny. That's what happens when you let another country control and remove your assets for the gain of their entitled ruling classes. What's more, Norway achieved this with a smaller oil and gas sector than Scotland's, yet because they controlled their own resources, they made 3 times more revenues than England did, because England squandered these Scottish resources by selling them off too cheaply to multi-billion-dollar corporations, and on tax breaks for these oil firms who bought these Scottish assets from England. And to ensure Scotland got virtually no benefit from its oil bonanza, the government in England shut down Scotland's last remaining stock exchange in Glasgow in 1973, just as the black gold started to flow ashore. In addition, England is about to shut down Scotland's only oil refinery at Grangemouth to ensure that Scotland is made artificially dependent on England by having all its oil refined at one of the 5 refineries located south of the border. Are you angry yet? Well, you should be. Whenever any union supporting Scott parrots the line that Scotland's too poor to survive without England to bail it out, I am genuinely left bewildered at how anyone can believe that, in the face of all the evidence that Norway and many other far smaller countries provide. To think countries like Malta, with a population of just over 553,000, about the same as Edinburgh, have their own voice and influence on the world stage as an independent country since 1964, and yet Scotland, with a population of more than 5.5 million, has no voice or influence internationally whatsoever. Yet according to the UK narrative, Scotland is too small to be independent, but not tiny countries like Malta, Luxembourg, Andorra, San Marino, or Monaco, apparently. So, despite voting overwhelmingly to remain in the European single market, England dragged Scotland out of the EU against the will of the people who in Scotland are sovereign, at a huge cost to the economy in Scotland, over £3 billion a year, according to the Scottish government. The cost of Brexit to the UK economy as a whole is £100 billion a year, and which is more than the entire cost of the UK's membership of the EU since 1973. And it's your hard-earned taxes that is paying for this very expensive fiasco, not to mention the £45 million pay rise King Charles has received, whilst the waspy women who paid into their national insurance over the years were told they would not be compensated for losing up to £45,000 each when the UK government changed their pension age to 65. Of course, those Scots who still support the union with England will retort that the oil has all but run out. So what's the point in Scotland becoming independent now? Well, aside from the fact that the oil hasn't all but run out according to UK Oil and Gas, which says that there is at least £1.7 trillion worth of oil left in Scottish waters, controlling your own destiny to ensure your country is run the way that most people who live in it would want, for the common good rather than for the benefit of a handful of entitled rich people, is the main reason for being a normal, independent country. Besides, Scotland has huge renewable assets as well. But Scotland's infinite renewable energy resources are also being asset stripped out of Scotland by the so-called UK Government of England. This has resulted in Scots paying among the highest energy prices in the world, despite the fact that Scotland can power every home in the country from its own renewables, but for the fact that its energy is being siphoned off to power homes in England without any real benefit to Scotland, whilst at the same time the private firms which now own these Scottish resources are making eye-watering profits. Worse still, a third of Scots cannot afford to heat their homes at all because the energy which belongs to them has been stolen by another country and sold to multi-billion-dollar corporations for the benefit of the shareholders and the ruling classes who run things from London. If you love paying very high energy prices, far higher than you need to, then I am sure you'll be delighted that Scotland is still in the UK. I suspect, however, that most Scots would prefer far lower bills and indeed a far lower cost of living in general, but that will never happen because the government in England is wedded to selling off everything for private profit, and that includes our cherished National Health Service. Although notionally devolved, which has allowed the Scottish NHS to largely outperform England's, Scotland's budgets are controlled by London, and the amount of money that goes to the Scottish NHS is determined by what the London government spends on the NHS in England under a complicated funding formula. There is no wiggle room for the devolved Scottish government to spend more, unless it takes money from another pressing priority from an ever-decreasing budget in which all of Scotland's revenues go to London, with a far smaller amount returning to Scotland. And the UK government in England has shown it is more than happy to override the so-called Scottish Parliament in Edinburgh, which is, in effect, a branch of the Westminster Parliament where MSPs swear allegiance to the king of another country rather than to the sovereign people of Scotland who voted for them. So, once the creeping privatisation of the English NHS is complete, and the whole thing is sold off to American health insurance corporations who've paid big money to Westminster politicians as part of a multi-million lobbying investment to secure their future, not yours, Scotland's NHS, like everything else in Scotland, will be stolen and sold off with the English NHS. And if you don't believe me, just look across the Atlantic to the United States, where well over 25 million people have no access to even basic healthcare because they simply cannot afford the expensive private health insurance payments every month. In 2024, the average annual health insurance premium for an individual was $8,952 a year, while the average for family coverage was $25,572 annually. Would you be able to afford more than £7,000 a year for individual health insurance, or over $20,000 a year to cover your family in the event of sickness? No? Well, it's coming down the line and will arrive far sooner than most people think if Scotland continues to allow England to run Scotland. When the UK English government wanted to privatise Scotland's public water supply, as it did with water in England, the then Strathclyde Regional Council held a postal referendum of Strathclyde residents on whether control of water and sewerage services should be privatized. A total of 1.2 million people voted, of whom 97% voted against privatization. Westminster was forced to concede, with domestic water supplies at least remaining a public service, and Scotland retains its public domestic water system for now. Angry at the successful challenge, the UK government in England abolished Strathclyde Regional Council and split it into 12 councils 2 years later, so that there would never be such a challenge from a large local authority ever again. So what was the UK government fighting for? It's fighting for the right for private firms to put profit before people again, as we have seen in England, where all the water supply is privately owned, and what a disaster that has been for my fellow countrymen. It's worth noting that aside from Chile and a few cities in the United States, England is the only country in the world to have a privately owned water system where big profits, rather than public health and well-being, is the name of the game. The collapse and bailout by taxpayers of Thames Water, which, far from resulting in a better, more efficient service, as advertised by the Thatcher government who privatized it in 1989, privatization has led to huge spikes in water bills, polluted rivers, and failing infrastructure, including leaking pipes, which is just the tip of the privatization iceberg. Publicly owned Scottish Water spent 35% more on fixing leaking pipes than its privatized English counterparts, whilst in England, water companies preferred to spend billions on dividends to shareholders rather than tackling its massive infrastructure problems. Before the last English Labour Holyrood administration was evicted from office in 2007, they half-privatised Scotland's water, creating Business Stream Limited, based in Dunfermline, which supplies water to Scotland's schools, hospitals and councils, as well as businesses. By now, I would expect anyone still watching to be incandescent with rage at what the UK government is doing to Scotland, because on a day-to-day basis, far from enjoying the lives most Norwegians enjoy, being in the top 10 of the Quality of Life Index, Scots and the English population are behind countries like Lithuania, Slovenia and Estonia, who all enjoy a far better standard of living than we do. And guess what? The Netherlands, with no oil or whiskey revenues, which alone are worth between £5 to £6 billion a year to the English exchequer, is third on that list, Switzerland coming first. And whilst I can be angry at my government in England for this rush to cut services, privatise everything, so it can be asset stripped for the benefit of the entitled class in my country, you don't have to put up with it. You, the people of Scotland, are sovereign, and you certainly do not need the permission of another country that has assumed control of yours to leave this sinking ship. And so whilst Westminster removes winter fuel payments for the elderly and the SNP devolved administration mitigates yet another bad policy by restoring them in Scotland despite having their overall budgets cut again by London, Scots, instead of getting angry, should be asking, what kind of country do I want my children and grandchildren to live in? Older people in particular, according to surveys, are more likely to support the continuation of the Union, yet they are often the hardest hit by Westminster cuts. Their continued support of the Union can be for a wide range of reasons: emotional bonds, ignorance of the facts as a result of constant reinforcement of the narrative told by mainstream media on behalf of this dysfunctional Union, a sense of pride in perceived past glories or misplaced loyalty to the ruling classes headed up by the King of England. Whatever the reason, if you want your children and grandchildren to have a better future than they will have in a failing union, then, please, don't let your past be their future. If you have found this film informative, please like and subscribe to our channel. For more information about the Scotland Channel and how you can support us, visit our website at thescotlandchannel.tv. And don't forget to hit the notification bell to be informed of new releases from the Scotland Channel.